So I've been thinking about reality a lot lately, which is, I don't know, one of those sentences that kind of freak people out because I feel like right after you ask the question, what is reality? It seems like you're probably something like 3 minutes away from sounding like you're either going to get really philosophical or you're just really high. But that's not really what I've been thinking about or how I got here. I started to think about this somewhat recently because in my profession, sitting down with people on a daily basis and talking about their lives, it seems to be a pretty ordinary thing that two people can go through basically the same thing, the same experience, and somehow walk away having experienced two completely different things. And I don't just mean like they disagree about what happened. I mean, sometimes it seems like they genuinely lived through two completely different versions of the same story. And that's always made me really curious. Like, how much of reality do we actually share? And on that note, welcome to The Thoughtful Therapist. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. And maybe even share with a friend. So let's take this one thought at a time. So initially, in thinking about this, I thought there was going to be a pretty easy answer to this. There's reality, and then there's our experience of reality. Reality being what's actually there. The stuff that always seems to, I don't know, push back maybe. It's like gravity. The fact that things exist, other people, the physical world itself. Things that continue existing, whether I believe in them or not. Like time is probably a pretty good example of that. And then there's my experience of all of that. How it feels, the things that I notice, what I remember or don't, what it means or feels like to be me. Okay, so those two things separated seem pretty clean. There seems to be one reality and billions of different experiences of it. Except I'm not convinced that it is actually that clean. So one of the things with this that I often think about is identical twins. So in my doctoral research on adoption, I've come across a number of twin studies, like a lot of them. And for this conversation, this actually matters quite a bit because it's about as close to two people starting at the same point as we're possibly going to get. So two people with the same genetics, raised by the same parents, in the same house, most likely educated in the same schools and surrounded by the same peers. So the same basic environment. And the studies show that when you talk to them as adults, it almost seems like you could swear that they grew up in completely different families. One may remember a warm and supported childhood, while the other remembers pressure. One remembers dad as being encouraging, not just to them, but to other members. Then the other might remember feeling like they were just never good enough for him. Now, this isn't a sure thing, and not all twins have this experience, but enough of them to show in research on the topic. And here's where this gets really interesting. Like, which childhood was real? Well, both of them, right? Now, there's probably some objective history underneath all of that. There was a house, there were parents, things happened, but neither twin experienced the objective history. They experienced being themselves within it, inside that history. So perhaps that's the distinction here. We share reality, just experience it differently. I like that answer. But it's not clean either because I think that it leads to more problems. So here, I kind of want to think about depression. So someone's life can look almost identical from the outside, much like the twins, just within one specific person. Like nothing had objectively changed about their history. Same family house, experience, friends, etc. But yet somehow everything seems to have changed for that person. But things that mattered don't feel like they matter anymore. Getting out of bed feels different. The future looks and feels different. And even memories start to feel different. With depression often morphed into a darker version of themselves. And it's funny, actually, the film Inside Out does a really good job of showcasing this. After she runs away and the darkness kind of descends on all of her childhood memories and all those like different lands in her head. And I feel like I need to be careful here because I'm not saying the physical world changed, because it absolutely did not. But it's interesting because if almost everything about how that world is experienced changes, then how meaningful is it to say, well, technically, you're still living in the same reality? Because you are, but you're also not. At least not in the same way. And not in the way that seems to matter to the person who's actually living through it. So now I'm already having trouble with my nice, clean distinction, but okay. So maybe the underlying reality is still stable. The person changed. Depression, experiences, whatever, fair enough. But then I started thinking about Denver. Stay with me here. Let's say that I fly to Denver and I get off the plane, and now I'm at more than 5,000 feet above sea level. The air pressure is lower, and my body has to adapt. So my breathing changes, my heart rate changes, and with it, my sleep patterns change, my energy levels change. And because my brain isn't floating around separately from my body, that can affect how I feel and how I think too. Now that's interesting, because the world outside of me has physically changed, which changes my body, which changes the apparatus in which I'm using to experience the world. So where exactly does that old reality stop and my current experience of reality begin? But I'm not sure there's such a clean line, because it's not like I experienced Denver first and then interpret it, because I'm a biological organism inside Denver. The environment is already interacting with me before I've had a single second to think about it. Okay, so this is still manageable though. One reality, different organisms interacting with different parts of it. I can live with that. So let's make it a little bit harder. What if the world really is different for you? Imagine two people born on the same day, same time. Yeah. One grows up in severe poverty in a township in the DR. And the other is born into, let's say, I don't know, Australian aristocracy. Now we're not just talking about attitude or memory or interpretation. The literal opportunities available to those people are actually different. Their risks are different. Access to education, healthcare, safety, their social connections, it's all different. Even the futures that are realistically available to them can be radically different. So yes, they inhabit the same planet. They're both biological beings. Their environment plays a role. But does saying that they live in the same reality actually tell us very much? Because the world itself does not meet them in the same way. And that kind of got me thinking. I wonder if I've been treating reality as something much simpler than it really is. So for me, there's a really interesting story here. And so for me, there's another reason that I've been thinking about this. A friend of mine years ago now died from a series of brain aneurysms. And he had one, according to doctors, a few days before he died. And he changed. And at that time, we didn't know why. Something was just so weird. His behavior had changed. His personality had changed drastically. And I don't mean like violently, but he was just like a really different person for like 7 or 8 days. His relationships started breaking down. I mean, even with his mom, things that seemed, I don't know, like obvious changes to the people around him, specifically about this like new way of thinking, acting, speaking, just were not obvious from where he was standing somehow. And looking back, there was something physically happening inside of his brain. And that changed the way I think about those final days. Because from our perspective, he was changing. But I wonder what it felt like from his perspective. Maybe everyone else seemed to be changing, or people's reactions were becoming unreasonable, or perhaps the world he found himself in itself stopped making sense, even though nothing had actually changed. I don't know. And that's the part that sticks with me. Because sometimes the world changes. Sometimes we change. Sometimes that changes from within inside ourselves. Sometimes outside. And I'm not convinced that we can always tell which one. And there's actually a name for some of this. This is where I eventually ran into phenomenology. And phenomenology can get complicated really quickly, so I'm going to try not to get too bogged down here. There are entire careers built around explaining this stuff, and that is not my career. But the basic idea that I found interesting is actually pretty simple. We don't experience some raw, unfiltered version of reality. We experience reality as it appears to us through our body, brain, personal, social, and familial history, through our memories, emotions, expectations, failure, successes, perceived relationship status, language, mental health, culture. Seriously, this list could continue forever, but I think you get it. Everything. There's no moment where I get to climb outside of being Jimmy and look at reality completely objectively and then climb back in. I'm always looking from somewhere. And so are you. And that's when this stopped feeling like some abstract philosophical problem to me. Because we do this to each other constantly. That's not what happened. You're overreacting. It wasn't that bad. How could you possibly see it that way? And there are times where maybe those criticisms are justified. People can be wrong. Memory is often wrong. I can absolutely misunderstand something. And this isn't an argument that everyone's version of reality is equally accurate, but it does make me wonder whether understanding another person requires something more than figuring out which one of us has the facts right. Maybe I also have to understand what those facts looked like from where they were standing. And it's interesting, actually, because hallucinogens are a really interesting example of this. So I'm not going to get like super in depth with hallucinogens at all. But hallucinogens can alter the way that the brain processes your perceptions, your memory, meaning, even your sense of who you are. And suddenly the exact same world can look profoundly different. Like the room didn't change, your life didn't change, but the reality being experienced certainly seems to have changed. That's probably a season 2 conversation, though. And this gets even stranger when you stop thinking about individuals and start thinking about groups. Because groups seem capable of building their own versions of reality, too. We see this often with like group think, families, companies, friend groups, or just entire cultures. And if you spend enough time inside of a group, certain things just start to become obvious. Like, of course, this is how the world works. Of course, those people are wrong. Everybody I know sees this. And that's really interesting because I might look around the room to figure out what's true, while everyone else in the room is looking around at everyone else to figure out what's true. So now we can reinforce an idea without any of us actually going back and checking it against the world or reality. And sometimes people don't even privately agree. They just think everyone else agrees. There's actually a name for that. It's called pluralistic ignorance, which is kind of incredible. A group can maintain a shared version of reality that many of the individual people inside the group do not currently or completely believe in, but they'll act upon it. So now I've got another problem. Because apparently my experience of reality isn't just shaped only by my brain, my body, my history, my environment, and the things that I notice. But it's also shaped by the other people I use to help me figure out reality, to figure out what's real. And then just when I thought this was mostly a problem for psychology and philosophy, physics decides to make it weird. So there's a famous experiment called the double slit experiment. Now, I'm not going to explain this experiment to you in depth. I'm sure that there are parts of this that I don't understand. But the basic version goes something like this. You send particles, electrons, for example, towards a barrier with two openings. And depending on how the experiment is set up and whether information about these particles' path is being obtained, you can get dramatically different patterns. Now, without path information, you can get an interference pattern associated with wave-like behavior. But when the setup allows you to determine which path the particles took, the interference disappears. Now, this does not mean that human consciousness magically creates reality. And so the basis of this is something like we put a proton or a stream of protons through this experiment, and you get a different result if those protons are being observed than if they are not. Wild. So this is one of those explanations that sounds really cool on the internet, which is probably where I got it, and gets messy really quickly, though, because the measurement itself involves physical interaction with the system. But I still just find it so fascinating because even at this incredibly fundamental level, questions about what can even be observed break down. So what can be known? How do we measure something? What are we justified in saying about what we've measured? And those questions get surprisingly difficult. And I'm not going to pretend to understand quantum mechanics well enough to solve that problem at all. People considerably smarter than me are still arguing about what quantum mechanics ultimately tells us reality is. Which honestly, kind of makes me feel a little bit better in the means of this podcast. So I started this thinking that there was probably a clean answer. One objective reality with lots of subjective experiences. And I still think there's something like basically right about that. Like, I don't think reality is arbitrary. I don't think that I can believe myself out of gravity or oxygen or like death. The world constrains us. Something is clearly pushing back, as I stated earlier. But whatever that underlying reality is, I never seem to receive it in its raw form, only through this body, this brain, this particular little spot in the universe that happens to be Jimmy, as you receive it through yours. So maybe saying that we exist in completely separate realities goes too far. But saying we all experience the same reality seems to go too far in the other direction. Maybe we're doing something stranger. Maybe we share a world while each of us encounters a version of that world that nobody else will ever experience exactly the same way. And I think that matters because it gives credence to the idea of individuals being unique. And maybe that's not just interesting philosophically. Maybe it changes something about how we treat each other. Because when somebody sees something completely different than I do, or feels something completely different than I do, or believes something completely different than I do, my first instinct can be to figure out who's right. And honestly, again, sometimes we need to do that. Truth matters, facts matter. Reality has constraints. But maybe there's another question worth asking first. What does the world look like from where you're standing? Not because your answer automatically becomes true and not because mine automatically becomes false, but because if I actually want to understand you, I probably need to understand more than just what happened, but how you got that thought or that feeling or what have you. I need to understand how you got there. And maybe that's as close as we ever get to stepping into someone else's reality. And this is really part of why I wanted to make this podcast, because the more I've talked to people, the more I've realized that when you actually understand how someone got to be where they are, or maybe even more importantly, trying to, they usually make a lot more sense. You care more about them and how they think, and they become people. Now, again, that doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean I'm right. But there's usually a reason they think the way they do. And from their perspective, often it's a pretty good one. And the moment I reduce somebody to you're just wrong, I stop being curious about why or them. And strangely, that usually pushes us further into our own corners. If I think you're wrong about something factual, I can give you information. We can argue about it. We can disagree. But there's a difference between challenging an idea and deciding something about the person who has the idea. One leaves room for us to understand each other. The other pretty much ends that conversation. So, do we share a reality? Maybe. But I'm much less certain about what that sentence means than I was when I started writing this episode. And weirdly, it almost feels like progress on the topic. Because understanding reality doesn't appear to start with being certain about what it is. Perhaps it begins by recognizing how incredibly strange it is that billions of us can occupy the same world and somehow experience it from billions of places no one else could ever completely reach. We share a world, but I'm not sure we ever share it in quite the same way. And the answer to what is reality, it doesn't seem likely to me that we fully understand the question. So maybe the goal isn't to solve reality. Maybe it's to understand how we're living within it. Reality is really weird. Thanks for thinking this through with me. The Thoughtful Therapist.